The fare was 8 miles and 12 minutes, which meant maybe $3 if the old man remembered to tip at all. Jalen watched the pin on his screen pulse outside a brick apartment complex that had seen better decades, and he felt his jaw tighten before the passenger even appeared. VA Medical Center. Of course. The algorithm had blessed him with another veteran fare, another slow shuffle to the curb, another silent ride to a waiting room that smelled like floor wax and resignation. He had bills to pay, nursing school loans that multiplied like cells under a microscope. And here he was, stuck with a ride that would barely cover the gas it took to get there. The old man emerged from the building's front door, and Jalen's fingers drummed against the steering wheel. 75, maybe 80, moving with that careful precision that meant every step was a negotiation with gravity. He wore a plaid short-sleeve shirt that had been washed so many times the pattern was more memory than fabric. Canvas messenger bag hung across his chest, and on his head, a faded green cap with a patch so worn Jalen couldn't make out what it once said. Another veteran cap. Jalen had seen hundreds of them in the 18 months he'd been driving. Baseball caps with unit numbers. Mesh truckers with American flags. Black caps with gold lettering announcing wars and service branches. Half the time he suspected they came from surplus stores, bought by men who wanted the respect without the service. Everyone was a veteran these days. Everyone had a story. The old man reached the car and paused, one hand on the door handle. His fingers were thin but steady, and Jalen noticed they moved with a strange economy. No wasted motion, as if even opening a car door required tactical consideration. The messenger bag shifted as he lowered himself into the back seat, and Jalen caught a glimpse of prescription bottles and the corner of what looked like a leather journal. VA Medical Center, please. The voice was soft, barely above a whisper, roughened by years of disuse. The kind of voice that belonged to a man who had stopped expecting anyone to listen. Jalen pulled away from the curb without responding. His phone was mounted on the dashboard, the blue line of the route stretching toward the highway entrance 3 blocks ahead. 8 miles, 12 minutes. Then he could get a real fare, maybe an airport run, something that would actually make this Tuesday worth the gas. Nice hut. The words came out before Jalen could stop them, sharper than he intended. Seems like everyone's got one of those these days. The old man didn't respond. In the rearview mirror, Jalen watched him sit perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on something beyond the window. Something Jalen couldn't see. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories like this one about hidden heroes and unexpected conversations speak to you, consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that remind us to look closer at the people around us. Now, let us continue. The highway entrance was 2 blocks ahead when Jalen's phone screen flickered. He glanced down just as the GPS froze, the blue line stuttering like a dying heartbeat. He tapped the screen. Nothing. Tapped again. The whole display went dark for 3 seconds, then came back with the route recalculating in an endless loop. Come on. Jalen stabbed at the power button, but his phone had decided that today, of all days, was the day to stage a revolt. The battery icon showed 62%, which meant nothing was wrong except everything was wrong. He missed the highway entrance while fighting with the device, and by the time he looked up, he was on a street he didn't recognize heading in a direction that felt entirely incorrect. The old man leaned forward. His movement was smooth, almost silent, and suddenly he was close enough that Jalen could smell soap and something else, something older, like canvas and copper and earth. Take the service road. The whisper came from just behind Jalen's right ear. It runs parallel to the highway for 6 miles. Turn left at the water tower. Jalen wanted to argue. Wanted to say he didn't need directions from a passenger, that his phone would fix itself any second, that he knew this city better than some old man who probably hadn't driven in years. But something in that voice stopped him. Something certain. Something that suggested the man in his back seat had spent a lifetime memorizing routes and distances and terrain. The water tower appeared exactly where the old man said it would. Jalen turned left, and as the service road opened up ahead of him, empty and clear while the highway beside them choked with brake lights, he glanced in the rearview mirror again. The old man had settled back into his seat, hands still folded, eyes still distant. But now Jalen noticed something he hadn't missed before. On the man's right forearm, just visible below the sleeve of that faded plaid shirt, dark ink marked the weathered skin. Numbers, coordinates, maybe a date. And beneath them, words too small to read from this distance, written in a script that looked almost like a signature. The phone screen flickered once more and went completely black. Jalen pressed the power button and held it. Nothing. The device was dead, 62% battery and all, leaving him on an unfamiliar road with a GPS made of nothing but an old man's memory. How do you know this route so well? The question came out almost accusatory, but Jalen couldn't help it. He was lost now, dependent on a stranger, and something about that vulnerability made him defensive. The old man was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Jalen didn't understand. I spent a long time learning to memorize routes. Distances. It becomes habit after a while. The kind of habit you cannot unlearn even when you want to. Jalen assumed he meant trucking. Maybe taxi work back before apps took over. He almost said as much, almost made another dismissive comment about everyone having a past, but the words died in his throat when he saw the sign ahead. Traffic accident. Highway closed. Expect significant delays. The service road merged into a parking lot of stopped cars, red brake lights stretching toward the horizon like an infection. Jalen checked his dead phone reflexively, then dropped it in the cup holder with a curse. 40 minutes, the radio announced. Maybe longer. And here he was, stuck with an $8 fare and an old man who knew the roads better than his own technology. In the back seat, the old man reached up and touched his faded cap, adjusting it slightly, and for just a moment the worn patch caught the afternoon light. Jalen still could not read what it said, but he found himself wanting to know. The silence in the car was different now. Heavier. Waiting. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Jalen understood that what happened next would depend entirely on whether he had the courage to ask. The traffic did not move for 11 minutes. Jalen counted each one on the dashboard clock, watching the digital numbers change while the sea of brake lights ahead remained frozen in place. His dead phone sat in the cup holder like an accusation. 62% battery, and somehow the thing had simply decided to stop working. He had rides to complete, money to make, 14 hours of driving ahead of him if he wanted to make his loan payment this month. And instead, he was trapped on a service road with an old man who whispered directions like some kind of human GPS. The old man had not spoken since his comment about memorizing routes. He sat in the back seat with that unnerving stillness, hands folded over the messenger bag at his lap, watching the stopped cars ahead as if traffic jams were simply another form of waiting he had mastered long ago. Jalen found himself glancing at the rearview mirror more often than made sense, studying the lined face beneath the faded cap, the way the afternoon light caught the scar running along the old man's jawline. That scar. Jalen had not noticed it at first, but now he could not stop seeing it. A thin white line that started just below the ear and curved down toward the chin, the kind of scar that came from something sharp and deliberate. Not a surgical scar, not an accident scar, something else. The radio droned on about the accident ahead. Jackknifed semi. Hazmat concerns. Emergency crews on scene. The estimated delay had already climbed from 40 minutes to an hour, and Jalen felt his frustration building like pressure behind his eyes. He should have taken the highway when he had the chance. Should have ignored the old man's directions and trusted his phone to figure itself out. Now he was stuck, losing money with every minute that passed, and the only company he had was a stranger who seemed content to sit in silence until the sun went down. Do you want me to find another route? The old man's voice cut through Jalen's spiraling thoughts. There's a way through the industrial district. It adds 4 miles, but avoids the backup entirely. Jalen's hands tightened on the steering wheel. How do you know that? I know this city. The response was simple, matter of fact. I have walked most of it at one time or another, driven the rest. There are routes that do not show up on maps, paths that only exist if you know where to look. Something about the way he said it made Jalen pause. Not bragging, not trying to impress, just stating a fact, like a man describing the color of the sky. And beneath those words, something else. Oh wait, a history. The kind of knowledge that came from more than just living somewhere for a long time. Fine. Jalen pulled the car onto the shoulder, inching past the stopped vehicles until he reached a gap in the median. Tell me where to go. The old man guided him through a maze of side streets and industrial access roads, his directions precise to the foot. Turn right after the green dumpster. Left at the chain-link fence with the torn section. Straight through the lot with the abandoned forklift. Each instruction came exactly when Jalen needed it. Not a second too early or too late, as if the old man had driven this route 1,000 times in his mind. They emerged from the industrial district onto a clear stretch of road, the VA medical center visible in the distance, and Jalen felt something shift in his chest. Not gratitude exactly, something closer to unease. The kind of feeling that came when the world revealed itself to be different than you expected. You really do know every route. Jalen heard the surprise in his own voice. How long have you lived here? 53 years. The old man's reflection watched him from the rearview mirror. Eleanor and I moved here after I came home. She had family nearby. It seemed like as good a place as any to start over. Eleanor. Jalen remembered the wedding ring he had glimpsed earlier, the band worn thin from decades of wear. Your wife? She passed 3 years ago. The words came out steady, but something in the old man's posture changed. A slight settling, like a building shifting on its foundation. I stopped driving after that. The roads remind me too much of things I would rather not remember. Jalen wanted to ask what things. Wanted to push, to pry, to understand why an old man who could navigate a city from memory would give up driving because of what the roads reminded him of. But something held him back. Some instinct that told him this was not a door to open casually. Instead, he heard himself say something he had not planned to say. I lost my grandfather 6 months ago. The words felt strange in his mouth, like a confession. He raised me after my parents split, taught me how to drive, actually, used to take me out to empty parking lots on Sunday mornings and let me practice until I could parallel park with my eyes closed. The old man was quiet for a moment. Then, softly, he sounded like a good man. He was. Jalen's throat tightened unexpectedly. He served too. Desert Storm. Never talked about it much, though. I used to ask him questions when I was a kid, wanting to hear war stories like in the movies. He always changed the subject. Said some things were better left in the sand. The old man nodded slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. Deeper, more careful, as if each word was being weighed before release. Some of us do not talk because the words have not been invented yet. The language does not exist for certain experiences. And some of us do not talk because we swore oaths that will outlive us. Your grandfather understood something that most people never learn. That silence is not the same as forgetting. Sometimes silence is the only way to carry what cannot be put down. Jalen felt the words land somewhere deep in his chest. He had heard people talk about veterans before, had listened to podcasts and watched documentaries and read articles about service and sacrifice. But this was different. This was not performance or politics. This was an old man in the back seat of an Uber describing something he had lived. The VA medical center was less than 2 miles away now. The ride was almost over. In a few minutes, Jalen would drop his passenger at the entrance and drive away and probably never think about this conversation again. That was how it worked. Strangers passing through each other's lives like ships in the night, leaving nothing behind but a rating and maybe a tip. But Jalen did not want this ride to end. Not yet. Not before he understood something that was scratching at the edges of his mind, demanding attention. That tattoo on your arm. The question came out before he could stop it. The numbers. Are those coordinates? The old man looked down at his forearm, as if seeing the ink for the first time in years. His fingers traced the faded lines, the numbers and letters that had been etched into his skin so long ago they had become part of him. Yes. His voice was barely a whisper now. They are coordinates. For place I was. A long time ago. A base? Jalen pressed. A deployment? The old man's eyes lifted to meet his in the rearview mirror, and for a moment Jalen saw something there that made his breath catch. Not sadness exactly. Something older than sadness. Something that had learned to live alongside grief the way a river learns to flow around stone. It was neither. It was a camp, in a country we were never officially in. A place that did not exist on any map then, and does not exist on any map now. The old man paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decades. I spent 3 years there, in a cage made of bamboo, and these coordinates are the only proof I have that any of it was real. The VA Medical Center entrance appeared on the right. Jalen drove past it without stopping. Jalen did not realize he had driven past the entrance until the old man spoke. You missed the turn. I know. Jalen's hands were steady on the wheel, but something inside him was shaking. He pulled into a parking lot across the street from the medical center and found a spot far from the other cars, where the afternoon shadows stretched long across the empty asphalt. He put the vehicle in park, but did not turn off the engine. The air conditioning hummed softly, filling the silence between them. 3 years. Jalen turned in his seat to face his passenger directly for the first time since the ride began. You said you spent 3 years in a cage. The old man's face was unreadable. His hands rested on the messenger bag in his lap, fingers curled loosely around the worn canvas strap. The faded cap cast a shadow over his eyes, but Jalen could see the way his jaw tightened slightly, the almost imperceptible shift in his breathing. I did. Where? The word came out sharper than Jalen intended. Where were you held for 3 years? The old man was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a car pulled into the VA parking lot and discharged a passenger, another elderly man with a cane who shuffled toward the entrance without looking back. Life continuing as normal while inside this Uber. Something fragile and enormous hung in the air between two strangers. Laos. The old man's voice was soft but steady. About 40 kilometers from the border with Vietnam, in a camp that was never supposed to exist, holding prisoners who were never supposed to be there. The coordinates on my arm marked the exact location. I calculated them myself. Using the stars and the position of the sun and the mountains, I could see through the gaps in the bamboo. It took me 11 months to get them right. Jalen felt the words land like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything he thought he understood about the man in his back seat. He had picked up veterans before, had heard stories about deployments and firefights and friends lost to roadside bombs. But this was different. This was not a story about serving and coming home. This was something else entirely. You were a POW. Jalen heard the disbelief in his own voice and hated it. A prisoner of war. The old man's lips pressed together in something that was not quite a smile. That is what they would have called us, yes, if they had admitted we existed. But we were in a country where American forces were not supposed to be operating, doing things that were not supposed to be happening. So when we were captured, there was no one to negotiate for our release. No Red Cross visits. No letters home. We simply disappeared. The words hung in the air like smoke. Jalen thought about all the dismissive comments he had made in his head since picking up this fare. The assumptions about surplus store caps and exaggerated stories. The cynicism that had calcified inside him after 18 months of driving strangers who all seemed to want something from him. And now here was this old man, this quiet passenger who whispered directions and sat with his hands folded and wore a wedding ring thinned by 50 years of marriage, telling him about bamboo cages and coordinates calculated by starlight in a camp that officially never existed. I did not expect you to believe me. The old man's voice cut through Jalen's spiraling thoughts. I have told this story to very few people in my life. Most of them are dead now. The ones who are still alive, they were there with me. They do not need me to tell them what happened, because they lived it too. Why are you telling me? Jalen did not mean for the question to sound accusatory, but it came out that way regardless. I am just your Uber driver. You do not know me. The old man considered this for a moment. His fingers moved to the messenger bag, tracing the outline of something inside. The journal, Jalen realized. The leather-bound book he had glimpsed when the old man got in the car. Because you asked. The response was simple, almost gentle. Because your phone died and your GPS failed, and instead of cursing at me or driving in angry silence, you asked me how I knew the routes. And then you told me about your grandfather, about the questions he would not answer, about the silence he carried home from the desert. Jalen's throat tightened. He had not thought of it that way, had not realized that his small confession about his grandfather had opened a door. The old man continued, his voice taking on a weight that pressed against the walls of the car. Your grandfather and I, we are not so different. We both serve in wars that asked impossible things of us. We both came home carrying weight that no one else could see. And we both learned that some stories are too heavy to tell to people who were not there. But every now and then, someone comes along who is willing to sit in the silence with us, to ask questions without demanding answers, to listen without judging. He paused, and when he spoke again, there was something almost fragile in his voice. You remind me of someone, a young medic who was in the camp with me. He used to ask questions too, not because he wanted war stories, but because he understood that sometimes a man needs to speak the words out loud just to prove to himself that they are real, that he is real, that what happened actually happened and was not just some nightmare that followed him home. What happened to him? Jalen asked. The medic. The old man's hand moved to his cap, adjusting it slightly, a gesture that Jalen was beginning to recognize as a kind of reflex, a way of buying time before answering difficult questions. He died 18 months into our captivity. Infection from a wound that should have been treatable. In any hospital in the world, he would have lived, but we were not in a hospital. We were in a bamboo cage in the mountains of Laos, and all I could do was hold his hand and tell him that someone would come for us, that we would not be forgotten. The old man's voice cracked on the last word, and Jalen saw something he had not expected. Moisture gathering at the corners of those distant eyes. Grief that had aged for decades, but had never fully healed. I lied to him. The confession came out barely above a whisper. I told him help was coming when I knew it was not. I told him we would make it home when I knew the odds were impossible. And he believed me. He died believing me. Jalen did not know what to say, did not know if there were words for a moment like this. So he did the only thing that felt right. He sat in the silence with the old man. Let the weight of the confession fill the space between them, without trying to fix it or explain it away. Outside, the sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the parking lot. The VA Medical Center stood waiting, full of other veterans with their own stories, their own silences, their own coordinates tattooed on their souls, if not their skin. The old man reached into his messenger bag and withdrew the leather journal. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened it to the first page. I want to show you something. His voice was steadier now, as if speaking the medic's death out loud had released some pressure valve inside him. This is how I survived. This is how I remembered where I was when no one else would admit I existed. He turned the journal so Jalen could see. And there, on the yellowed first page, drawn in faded ink with impossible precision, was a map of a place that should not exist. The map was drawn with the precision of a man who had nothing but time and everything to lose. Every line was deliberate, every marking purposeful. Jalen leaned closer, studying the faded ink that had bled slightly into the yellowed paper over the decades. He could make out the outline of a perimeter, small rectangles that must have been structures, dotted lines indicating paths or patrol routes, and in the center, a cluster of narrow shapes arranged in rows. Those are the cages. The old man's finger hovered over the cluster without touching the paper. Bamboo and wire. 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, 3 feet tall. Not big enough to stand. Not long enough to stretch out completely. You learn to sleep curled like a child in the womb. After a while, your body forgot what it felt like to be straight. Jalen stared at the dimensions. 8 by 4 by 3. He tried to imagine folding himself into a space that small and felt his chest tighten at the thought. How many men were held there? The number changed. The old man turned the page to reveal a list of names written in careful columns. Some had dates next to them. Some had small crosses. Some had circles. At its peak, 37 Americans. By the time I escaped the second time, there were 19 left. The crosses are the ones who died in captivity. The circles are the ones I brought home. Jalen counted the crosses. 18 of them, scattered throughout the list like wounds. 18 men who had died in bamboo cages in a country that would never acknowledge their presence. You said the second time. The words came out slowly as Jalen processed what he was hearing. You escaped twice? The old man closed the journal and held it against his chest, the worn leather pressing against the faded plaid of his shirt. His eyes had taken on a distant quality, focused on something far beyond the walls of the car. The first time was 18 months in. I had found a weakness in their routine, a gap in the patrols during the monsoon season when the rain was so heavy the guards could not see more than 10 feet in front of them. I spent 3 months memorizing their patterns, counting their footsteps, timing their shifts. And when the moment came, I went through the wire. His hand moved unconsciously to his jaw, tracing the scar that Jalen had noticed earlier. The fence was reinforced with wire that had been salvaged from downed aircraft, sharp enough to cut through bone if you moved too fast. I was careful, but not careful enough. The wire caught me here. He tapped the scar. I bled so much I thought I would pass out before I reached the tree line. But I made it. 11 days in the jungle, moving only at night, eating whatever I could find that would not kill me. 11 days of freedom. What happened? Jalen asked, though part of him did not want to know. The old man's jaw tightened. I was recaptured. A patrol found my trail and tracked me to a riverbank where I had stopped to drink. I was too weak to run, too dehydrated to fight. They brought me back to the camp and made an example of me in front of the other prisoners. 2 weeks of beatings. Then isolation. Isolation. Jalen repeated the word, sensing there was more weight to it than he understood. A box. The old man's voice had gone flat, emotionless, as if he was describing something that had happened to someone else. Wooden slats nailed together. Not big enough to stand, not wide enough to sit. You could only crouch. For 3 months, I lived in that box. They opened it once a day to throw in rice and water. The rest of the time, I was alone with the heat and the insects and the sound of my own breathing. Jalen felt sick. He had heard about torture, had seen documentaries about POW camps, but hearing it described in this quiet voice by this quiet man made it viscerally real in a way that images on a screen never could. How did you survive that? The old man was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed again, softer now, almost wondering. I did not think about survival. I thought about the map. Every hour I spent in that box, I was drawing in my mind, refining the patrol routes, calculating distances, memorizing the faces of the guards and the sounds of their footsteps. I turned my prison into a classroom, and I made myself the most dedicated student you have ever seen, because I knew something that my captors did not know. What was that? That I was going to try again. The old man looked up, and for the first time since the conversation began, something like fire flickered behind his eyes. That box was supposed to break me. It was supposed to teach me that escape was impossible, that resistance was futile, that I should accept my fate and wait to die like the others. But instead, it gave me 3 months of uninterrupted time plan. 3 months to perfect every detail of my next attempt. And this time, I was not going to leave alone. The words hung in the air between them. Jalen realized he had stopped breathing and forced himself to inhale. The parking lot outside had grown quieter as the afternoon aged, shadows stretching longer across the asphalt. The VA Medical Center standing silent in the distance like a monument to all the stories contained within its walls. The second escape. Jalen's voice came out rough. You took others with you. 7 men. The old man opened the journal again, turning to a page near the middle. Their names were written in a different ink, darker, more deliberate, as if each letter had been carved rather than written. Martin Reyes, Gerald Sutton, David Chun, William Patterson, Thomas Nakamura, Robert Blackwood, James Whitfield. I had been communicating with them for weeks through tap codes on the walls of our cages. We developed a plan, a route, a series of signals. And when the moment came, We move as one. His finger traced the names as he spoke, and Jalen noticed that some had small notations beside them. Dates, locations, words too small to read from this distance. It took us 14 days to reach friendly territory. 14 days through jungle so thick you cannot see the sun. 14 days with injuries and infections and no food except what we could scavenge. Robert Blackwood had a broken leg that had never healed properly. William Patterson was half blind from malnutrition. I carried them when they could not walk. We all carried each other. The old man paused, and when he continued, his voice cracked just slightly. We made it, all 7 of us. A helicopter extraction at coordinates I had memorized from fragments of radio chatter I had overheard months before. When those rotors appeared over the tree line, when I saw that American star painted on the side, I fell to my knees and wept like a child. Jalen felt moisture on his own cheeks and realized he was crying. He wiped his face quickly, embarrassed, but the old man did not seem to notice. His eyes were still fixed on the names in the journal, on the men he had carried through 14 days of jungle hell. That should have been the end. The old man's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I should have gone home, healed, try to forget. That is what they told me to do. That is what Eleanor begged me to do when I finally saw her again. But you did not. Jalen said it as a statement, not a question. He already knew the answer. The old man shook his head slowly. I cannot, because there were still 19 men in that camp. 19 Americans rotting in bamboo cages that my own government would not admit existed. And I was the only person alive who knew exactly where they were and exactly how to get them out. He closed the journal and looked up at Jalen with eyes that had seen things no human being should ever have to see. So I volunteered to go back. Jalen stared at the old man, as if he had just announced he could walk through walls. The words did not make sense. Could not make sense. A man who had spent 3 years in a bamboo cage, who had escaped twice, who had been beaten and starved and locked in a box for 3 months, had looked at freedom and chosen to turn around and walk back into hell. You volunteered. Jalen heard the disbelief in his own voice. After everything they did to you, you went back. The old man's hands tightened on the journal, knuckles whitening against the worn leather. His eyes had taken on that distant quality again, seeing something beyond the parking lot and the medical center and the ordinary Tuesday afternoon that had somehow become extraordinary. You have to understand what it was like. His voice was measured, careful, as if he was choosing each word from a limited supply. When I came out of that jungle with those 7 men, I was the only person in the world who had been inside that camp and lived to tell about it. I knew the layout. I knew the patrol schedules. I knew which guards could be bribed and which ones would die before giving an inch. I knew where they kept the weapons and where they stored the food and which paths through the perimeter were blind spots after dark. He paused, and when he continued, there was something almost pleading in his tone, as if even now, decades later, he needed someone to understand. The military had been trying to locate those camps for years. They had satellite imagery and intelligence reports and local informants, but none of it was enough. The camps moved. The guards changed. The jungle swallowed everything. But I had lived it. I had memorized it. I had turned 3 years of captivity into a map that no satellite could ever capture. Jalen thought about what the old man was describing. Not just courage, but something beyond courage. A kind of moral calculus that most people would never have to face. The choice between safety and salvation. Between going home to a wife who loved him and going back for strangers who were counting the days until death. How many times? The question came out hoarse. How many times did you go back? The old man opened the journal to a section near the back. The pages here were different from the earlier ones. More cramped. More urgent. Dates and coordinates and names written in a hand that seemed to grow steadier with each entry, as if the act of recording had become its own form of survival. 11 missions over 18 months. His finger traced the entries as he spoke. Some were extractions. Get in, get the men, get out before anyone knew we were there. Others were reconnaissance. Mapping new camps, identifying prisoners, gathering intelligence for future operations. And some are things I'm still not permitted to discuss, even now. He looked up at Jalen, and something in his expression shifted. A vulnerability that seemed at odds with everything else about him. I was not alone. I need you to understand that. There were other men, good men, who went into that darkness with me. Some of them did not come back. Their names are in this journal too, but they are the names I do not speak aloud. The names that only exist in the silence between heartbeats. Jalen thought about his grandfather, about the questions that were never answered and the stories that were never told. He had always assumed his grandfather's silence was about pain, about memories too terrible to share. But now he wondered if it was something else. If there were names his grandfather carried too. Names that only existed in the silence. 23. The old man said the number like a prayer. 23 Americans came home because of those missions. 23 men who had been written off as missing in action, presumed dead, lost to a war that was supposed to be winding down. Their families had stopped hoping. Their government had stopped looking. But we found them, and we brought them home. He turned to a page in the journal that was different from the others. A photograph had been taped to the paper, yellowed and cracked with age. 11 men standing in a jungle clearing, emaciated and hollow-eyed, but alive. Some were leaning on each other for support. Some were barely standing at all. But they were all looking at the camera with expressions that Jalen could only describe as resurrection. This was the day we got out. The old man's voice broke slightly. The 7 who escaped with me the second time. This photograph was taken 20 minutes before the helicopter arrived. We did not know if we would make it. We did not know if the extraction point had been compromised or if the helicopter would even come. But we wanted proof. We wanted something that would survive even if we did not. Jalen studied the faces in the photograph. Young men made old by suffering. Eyes that had seen things no human should see. And in the center, standing slightly apart from the others, a figure he almost did not recognize. Younger, thinner, but with the same stillness, the same quiet intensity that filled the back seat of his car. That is you. Jalen said it softly, almost reverently. The old man nodded. 31 years old. I had gone into that camp weighing 185 pounds. When that photograph was taken, I weighed 112. 3 years of starvation and disease and things I will not describe had taken everything from me except the one thing that mattered. What was that? The old man looked up from the photograph, and for a moment his eyes met Jalen's with an intensity that made the young man's breath catch. The knowledge that I could go back, that I had something no one else had, a map in my head and a debt in my heart. Those 19 men were still in that camp when I walked out of the jungle. 19 Americans who had watched me leave and wondered if I would forget them, if I would go home and try to pretend they did not exist. He closed the journal slowly, pressing the photograph against his chest. I could not do that. I could not sit in a hospital bed and eat 3 meals a day and sleep in a real bed knowing that they were still there, still waiting, still hoping that someone would come for them the way I had promised the medic someone would come for us. The medic. Jalen remembered the story from earlier. The young man who had died believing help was on the way. The lie that had become a prophecy. You kept your promise to him. Jalen said it quietly. You made the lie true. The old man was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I tried. God help me, I tried. 23 men came home, but there were others I could not reach. Others who died before we could get to them. Others whose camps we never found. I carry their names too. The names of the ones I could not save. And those names are heavier than all the others combined. Outside, the shadows had grown longer. The VA medical center stood waiting, full of men and women carrying their own names, their own maps, their own coordinates tattooed on their souls. And Jalen understood, finally, why this old man had stopped driving. Why the roads reminded him of things he would rather not remember. Because every road led back to the jungle. Every route was a path he had walked in darkness, carrying men who could not carry themselves, leaving behind men he could not save. Can I ask you something? Jalen's voice was rough with emotion. The old man nodded. Your call sign. Earlier, when you mentioned the camps, the guards. What do they call you? For the first time since the conversation began, something like a smile crossed the old man's weathered face. Rattlesnake. He said the word with a weight that made it sound like both a curse and a blessing. One of the guards gave me that name after the first escape. He said I was like a rattlesnake, impossible to keep caged. And just when you think I am dead, I strike. Rattlesnake. Jalen let the word settle into the silence of the car. It fit somehow. This quiet old man with his faded cap and his worn journal and his hands that moved with such careful precision. There was something coiled about him, something patient and watchful that Jalen had sensed from the moment he climbed into the back seat but had not been able to name until now. The guard spread that name through the camp after I was recaptured the first time. The old man's voice had taken on a different quality. Not quite pride, but something adjacent to it. A recognition of what he had become in that terrible place. They used it as a warning. A reminder of what could happen if they grew complacent. But the other prisoners heard it too. And for them, it became something else. What did it become? Hope. The word came out soft, almost fragile. When I was in the isolation box, when they thought I was broken, the other prisoners would tap on the walls at night. Tap codes we had developed over months of captivity. And they would spell out one word over and over. Rattlesnake. 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 It was their way of telling me they were still there, that they were waiting, that they believed I would find a way out again. Jalen tried to imagine it. Men in bamboo cages, starving and sick and hopeless, tapping on walls in the darkness, spelling out the name of a man in a wooden box who had become their only reason to keep breathing. The image was almost too much to hold. When I finally got out of isolation, the old man continued. The first thing I did was tap back. One word. Soon. And I meant it. I had spent 3 months in that box perfecting every detail of the escape plan. I knew exactly which night we would go, which guards would be on duty, which path through the wire would give us the best chance. All I needed was to communicate the plan to the others without the guards catching on. How long did that take? 6 weeks. 6 weeks of tapping on walls, passing messages through the men who carried our waste buckets, using hand signals during the brief moments we were allowed outside our cages. The guards never suspected. They thought I was broken. They thought isolation had done what beatings could not. But I was more dangerous than I had ever been, because now I had nothing left to lose. The old man paused, his eyes focusing on something beyond the windshield. The memory seemed to pull at him, dragging him back through decades to a night in the mountains of Laos when 7 men had staked everything on a plan drawn in the mind of a man called Rattlesnake. The night we went, there was no moon. The old man's voice dropped lower, as if the guards might still be listening. We waited until the shift changed, that 3-minute window when the perimeter was at its weakest. Martin Reyes went first. He was the smallest, the quietest. He cut through the wire while Gerald Sutton kept watch. Then David Chun. Then William Patterson, even though he could barely see. One by one, we slipped through that gap like water through a crack in a dam. His hands were trembling slightly now, the journal shaking against his chest. I went last. I always went last. Because if something went wrong, if the guards spotted movement, I needed to be the one who stayed behind to create a distraction. That was the deal I had made with myself. The others would escape, even if it meant I did not. But nothing went wrong. The old man shook his head slowly. Something always goes wrong. Robert Blackwood's leg gave out 50 meters past the wire. He went down hard, and the sound carried. A guard shouted. Flashlights started sweeping the tree line. We had maybe 30 seconds before they reached the breach point. Jalen held his breath. He knew how this story ended. He had seen the photograph, counted the circles in the journal. All 7 men had made it out, but knowing the ending did not diminish the tension of the telling. I told the others to keep moving. The old man's voice was steady now, the trembling replaced by something harder. I went back for Robert, threw him over my shoulder like a sack of rice and ran. I do not know how I did it. I weighed 120 pounds at that point. Robert weighed at least 160 even after 3 years of starvation. But the body can do impossible things when the alternative is unthinkable. The flashlights found the breach. The old man's eyes were closed now, reliving it. The guards started shooting into the jungle, but they were firing blind. They did not know which direction we had gone. I had planned for that. The escape route doubled back twice, used streams to hide our tracks, led us through terrain so dense that pursuit on foot was nearly impossible. 14 days, Jalen said softly. You mentioned it took 14 days to reach friendly territory. The old man opened his eyes. 14 days of moving only at night, sleeping in shifts, eating insects and roots, and whatever small animals we could catch without making noise. William Patterson developed a fever on day 4. Thomas Nakamura's wounds from the wire became infected on day 7. Robert's leg swelled so badly we had to carry him the last 60 miles. His voice cracked slightly, but we made it, every single one of us. When that helicopter appeared over the tree line, when I heard those rotors cutting through the morning air, I understood something that has stayed with me for the rest of my life. What was that? That some things are worth any price. The old man looked at Jalen with eyes that held decades of pain and triumph and grief all tangled together. Those 7 men had families, wives who had been told they were dead, children who had grown up without fathers, parents who had buried empty coffins. And because we made it out, because we refused to die in those cages, 43 people got to hold someone they loved again. He paused, doing the math that had clearly become second nature. 7 men, 7 wives, 12 children, 17 parents still living. And the ripples went further than that. The children grew up and had children of their own. Families that exist today because 7 starving men crawled through a hole in a fence on a moonless night in Laos. Jalen thought about ripples, about the way a single action could spread outward through time, touching lives that would never know where the wave began. His grandfather had served in Desert Storm, had come home and raised a grandson who was now sitting in an Uber with a man whose courage had created families that stretched into generations. The old man seemed to read his thoughts. Your grandfather, whatever he did over there, whatever he carried home in his silence, it rippled too. It brought him back to you. It made you who you are. And now here you are, listening to an old man tell stories in a parking lot when you could be making money on your next fare. Jalen glanced at his dead phone in the cup holder. He had forgotten about fares, forgotten about loan payments and 14-hour shifts and all the things that had seemed so important 2 hours ago. This matters more. The words came out before he could stop them. What you're telling me, it matters more than any fare. The old man studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached up and removed his faded cap. Underneath, his hair was thin and white, plastered to his scalp with sweat. But it was not the hair that caught Jalen's attention. It was what was pinned to the inside of the cap, a medal, small and silver and shaped like a star, attached to a ribbon that had once been red, white, and blue, but had faded to something softer. The old man held the cap so Jalen could see it clearly. My wife pinned this here the day I finally came home for good. His voice was thick with emotion. She said it was the only medal I would ever wear. The only one that mattered. Because it meant the war was over. It meant I was hers again. Silver Star. Jalen recognized it from his grandfather's books. He had never seen one in person. The old man nodded. For actions that officially never happened. In a country where I was never officially present. Saving men who were never officially missing. He let out a breath that seemed to carry the weight of decades. The Army gave me this medal and then told me I could never speak of what I did to earn it. So I pinned it inside my cap where no one would ever see it. And I have carried it with me every day since. He placed the cap back on his head, the medal hidden once again against his scalp. You're the first person besides Eleanor who has ever seen where I keep it. The weight of what Jalen had just witnessed settled over him like a blanket. This old man, this quiet passenger who had climbed into his car 2 hours ago, had just shown him something sacred. A medal pinned inside a cap where no one would ever see it. A lifetime of service hidden beneath faded fabric and worn stitching. And he had chosen to share it with a 24-year-old Uber driver who had almost let him ride in silence. Why me? The question came out before Jalen could stop it. Why are you telling me all of this? You do not know me. You do not owe me anything. I was rude to you when you got in the car. I made assumptions about your cap, about who you were. Why would you trust me with this? The old man was quiet for a long moment. His fingers moved to the messenger bag, tracing the outline of the journal inside. When he spoke, his voice carried a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything he had just described. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" Jalen shook his head. "I see a young man who is tired." The old man's eyes held no judgment, only understanding. Tired of driving strangers to places he will never go. Tired of working 14-hour days to pay for a future that feels impossibly far away. Tired of people who treat him like a servant instead of a human being. Jalen felt his throat tighten. He had not told the old man about his schedule, about his loans, about the bone-deep exhaustion that had become his constant companion. But somehow, this stranger had seen it all. "I also see a young man who stopped," the old man continued, "who asked questions instead of driving in silence, who shared a piece of his own grief when he had no obligation to do so, who pulled into this parking lot and turned off his meter because he sensed that something mattered more than money." Jalen glanced at the dashboard. The meter. He had completely forgotten about the meter. The fare had been running this entire time, climbing higher with every minute they sat in this parking lot talking about bamboo cages and moonless escapes and metals hidden inside caps. "I'm going to turn it off." Jalen reached for his phone before remembering it was dead. He let out a frustrated breath. "I cannot even turn it off. But I'm not charging you for this. Whatever the fare says when we get to the VA, I'm not taking your money." The old man smiled, and it transformed his face. For a moment, Jalen caught a glimpse of the 31-year-old soldier in that photograph. The man who had crawled through wire and carried his brothers through the jungle and refused to leave anyone behind. "You remind me of the medic." The old man said it softly. "The one who died in the camp. His name was Samuel. Samuel Okonkwo. He was 23 years old when they captured us. 25 when he died." Jalen felt the name land in his chest. Samuel Okonkwo. Not just a medic anymore. A person with a name and an age and a life that had been cut short in a bamboo cage in Laos. Samuel used to say that the most important thing a person could do was pay attention. The old man's voice had taken on a rhythmic quality, as if he was reciting something he had repeated to himself many times. Not just look but see. Not just hear but listen. He believed that most of the suffering in the world came from people being too busy or too afraid to truly notice each other. He paused, and when he continued, his voice was thick with emotion. In the camp, Samuel was the one who noticed when someone was giving up, when the light started going out of their eyes. He would sit with them through the night, talking about anything and everything, reminding them that they were still human beings and not just bodies in cages. He saved more lives with his attention than any medicine could have. Jalen thought about his own life. The endless stream of passengers who climbed into his car and stared at their phones and climbed out again without ever really seeing him. The loneliness of being surrounded by people who looked right through you. And here was this old man telling him that paying attention was an act of salvation. When Samuel died, the old man continued, "I made a promise to him. I told him I would pay attention for both of us, that I would notice the people who needed to be noticed, that I would listen to the stories that needed to be heard, and I would tell my own story when I found someone who was ready to hear it." He looked at Jalen with eyes that seemed to see everything. "You were ready. From the moment your phone died and you had to rely on a stranger's directions, you were ready. You just did not know it yet." Jalen felt tears threatening again and did not try to stop them. Something was shifting inside him. Some wall that he had built over 18 months of anonymous fares and silent rides was beginning to crack. "I have been so angry." The confession came out in a rush. Angry at the passengers who do not tip. Angry at the algorithm that sends me to the worst fares. Angry at the loans and the hours and the feeling that I am just a machine that moves people from one place to another. I stopped seeing them as people a long time ago. They were just ratings. Just dollar signs. Just obstacles between me and the end of my shift. The old man nodded slowly. "That anger is a cage of your own making. I know because I built one too. After I came home, after the missions were over and the war was done, I was so angry I could barely breathe. Angry at the government that had abandoned those men. Angry at the country that wanted to forget the war ever happened. Angry at myself for the ones I could not save." His hand moved to his chest, pressing against the place where the journal rested inside his bag. Eleanor saved me. She saw through the anger to the man underneath. She paid attention when no one else would. She listened to the stories I could not tell anyone else. And slowly, over years, she helped me tear down the walls I'd built. What happened when she died? Jalen asked softly. The old man's face changed. The lines deepened. The light in his eyes dimmed slightly. I started building them again. 3 years ago, when the cancer took her, I felt the walls going back up. I stopped talking to the friends we had made. Stopped going to the reunions with the men I had served with. Stopped doing anything except existing. I thought that if I made myself small enough, quiet enough, invisible enough, the grief would not be able to find me. Did it work? The old man let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for years. Grief always finds you. It does not matter how small you make yourself. It does not matter how many walls you build. Grief is patient. It waits. And eventually, it comes for you in a parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon, when a young man asks about the numbers on your arm, and suddenly you are telling stories you have not told in decades. He reached out and placed his hand on Jalen's shoulder. The touch was light but steady, warm through the fabric of Jalen's shirt. This conversation is not just for you. His voice was barely above a whisper. It is for me too. You gave me a reason to remember why I survived. Why any of us survived. It was not just to exist. It was to connect, to notice, to tell the stories that need to be told so that the people who live them are not forgotten. Jalen placed his own hand over the old man's. Two strangers in a parking lot, connected by a dead phone and a traffic jam and a willingness to pay attention. Thank you. Jalen's voice cracked. For trusting me with this. For seeing me. The old man squeezed his shoulder gently. Thank you for stopping. For asking. For being the kind of person Samuel would have recognized. He paused, and when he spoke again, there was something almost like peace in his voice. Now, I believe I have a knee appointment that I'm already quite late for. But before we go, there is one more thing I want to show you. The old man reached into his messenger bag and withdrew the photograph Jalen had seen earlier. The 11 men in the jungle clearing, emaciated and hollow-eyed, but alive. But this time, instead of holding it at a distance, he turned it over to reveal the back. Writing covered the surface. Names and dates and locations. Some in ink so faded it was barely visible, others added more recently in different handwriting. A record of something Jalen did not yet understand. After we came home, the old man said, we made a pact. The 7 of us who escaped together. We would stay in contact for the rest of our lives. We would call each other on the anniversary of the escape. We would be there for each other's weddings and funerals and everything in between. Because we knew something that most people never learn. What was that? That survival is not a solo act. The old man's finger traced the names on the back of the photograph. We got out because we carried each other. Literally. Robert Blackwood would have died 50 meters past the wire if I had not gone back for him. I would have died in isolation if the others had not tapped on the walls to keep me sane. None of us made it alone. And none of us were going to live alone either. He pointed to one of the names. Martin Reyes. He was the first one through the wire that night. The bravest of all of us in some ways, because he went into the darkness not knowing if the path was clear. After we came home, he struggled. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the feeling that he had left part of himself in that jungle and would never get it back. He called me one night, 3 years after we returned, and told me he had a gun in his hand and did not know if he could put it down. Jalen felt his stomach drop. I drove 400 miles through the night to get to him. The old man's voice was steady, but his hands were trembling. I sat with him until the sun came up, and then I sat with him the next night and the night after that. I did not leave until I knew he was going to be okay, because that is what we promised each other. No one gets left behind, not in the jungle, not in the darkness that follows. He moved his finger to another name, Gerald Sutton. He became a pastor after we came home. Said he had seen enough of hell to spend the rest of his life pointing people toward heaven. He officiated my wedding to Eleanor, baptized the children of 3 of the other men. When he died 2 years ago, we all flew in from wherever we were to carry his coffin. 6 old men who could barely lift it, but we carried it anyway, because that is what we do. Another name, David Chun. He is still alive. Lives in Seattle now, near his grandchildren. We talk every Sunday morning at 7 o'clock. Have not missed a call in 41 years. Sometimes we talk for an hour. Sometimes we just sit in silence on the phone, listening to each other breathe. Either way, we show up, because showing up is what matters. Jalen looked at the list of names, at the web of connections that spread out from that single photograph like roots from a tree. 7 men who had crawled through a fence together and spent the rest of their lives holding each other up. What about the others? He asked. The ones you went back for. The 23. The old man turned the photograph back over, studying the faces of the men he had carried out of hell. Some of them I never met face to face. The extractions were fast. Get in, get out, disappear before the enemy knew what happened. But I know their names. I know their stories. I have followed their lives from a distance, watched their children grow up, read their obituaries when they passed. He paused, and something complicated moved across his face. A few of them found me, tracked me down years later when some of the records were declassified. They wanted to thank me, wanted to shake the hand of the man who had pulled them out of the darkness. I never knew what to say to them. I was not a hero. I was just a man who knew where they were and could not leave them there. You were a hero. Jalen said it firmly. You went back 11 times. You risked your life over and over for men you had never met. That is the definition of a hero. The old man shook his head slowly. A hero would have saved them all. A hero would not have left anyone behind. But there were camps I never found. Prisoners I never reached. Men who died waiting for a rescue that never came. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. Those are the ones who haunt me, not the ones I saved. The ones I cannot save. I see their faces in my dreams. I hear them calling out in the darkness, asking why I did not come for them. And I have no answer. I have carried that weight for 50 years, and I will carry it until the day I die. Jalen did not know what to say. The scope of what this man had accomplished was staggering. 23 lives saved, families reunited, generations that existed because one man had refused to stop fighting. And yet he carried the weight of the ones he could not reach as if their deaths were his personal failure. You cannot save everyone. Jalen heard himself say the words and immediately felt their inadequacy. No one can save everyone. The old man looked at him, and for a moment his eyes held something that might have been gratitude. Samuel said the same thing to me once. In the camp, near the end. He was dying, and he knew he was dying, and he used some of his last breaths to tell me that I had to stop trying to carry the whole world on my shoulders. That some burdens were not mine to bear. He reached up and adjusted his cap, that unconscious gesture Jalen had come to recognize. I have never been very good at listening to that advice, but I've gotten better. Eleanor helped me understand that the weight does not go away, but you can learn to carry it differently. You can share it with people who love you. You can set it down sometimes, even if you always pick it back up. He looked at Jalen with something approaching hope. That is why I am telling you all of this, because every time I share this story, the weight gets a little bit lighter. Not because it disappears, but because someone else knows it exists. Someone else carries a piece of it with them. And suddenly I'm not alone with it anymore. Jalen understood. In his own small way, he understood the loneliness of carrying something that no one else could see. The relief of finding someone willing to witness your burden, even if they could not lift it. I will carry it. Jalen heard the promise in his own voice. Whatever piece of this you need me to hold, I will carry it. I will remember their names. I will remember what you did. And I will tell my own children someday, so that the memory does not die with us. The old man's eyes glistened. That is all any of us can ask. That someone remembers. That the story does not end when we do. He tucked the photograph back into his bag and took a deep breath, as if preparing to re-enter a world that had been waiting patiently outside the car. Now, I really must get to my appointment. My knee is not going to replace itself, and Dr. Nguyen will lecture me for an hour if I am any later than I already am. Jalen almost laughed. After everything they had discussed, after the jungle and the cages and the 50 years of carrying the uncountable dead, the old man was worried about being late for a knee appointment. It was so ordinary, so human, that it broke something loose in Jalen's chest. He started the car and pulled out of the parking space, heading toward the VA Medical Center entrance. But he already knew he was not going to just drop the old man off and drive away. Not anymore. Something had changed in the last 2 hours. Something that could not be unchanged. And as the entrance came into view, Jalen made a decision that would alter the course of his entire life. Jalen pulled up to the entrance of the VA Medical Center and put the car in park. The building loomed ahead of them, a sprawling complex of brick and glass that had seen generations of veterans pass through its doors. Men and women carrying wounds visible and invisible, seeking healing for bodies and minds that had been broken in service to their country. The old man reached for the door handle, then paused. He turned to look at Jalen with an expression that held something like farewell. "Thank you for the ride." His voice was formal now, returning to the quiet courtesy he had shown at the beginning. "And for the conversation. It has been a long time since I talked this much." Jalen shook his head. "I'm coming in with you." The old man's eyebrows rose. "You do not have to do that. I'm sure you have other fares waiting. Your phone will come back to life eventually, and you will need to make up for lost time. I'm coming in with you." Jalen repeated the words with a firmness that surprised even himself. "I'm not dropping you at the door and driving away like you are just another passenger. Not after everything you told me." For a moment, the old man looked like he might argue. Then something in his face softened, and he nodded slowly. "Very well." He opened the door and stepped out, moving with that careful precision Jalen had noticed from the beginning. The slight limp was more pronounced now, as if the hours of sitting had stiffened joints that never fully healed from bamboo cage damage. Jalen got out and walked around the car to join him. Together, they moved toward the entrance, an unlikely pair. A 78-year-old legend in a faded cap and a 24-year-old Uber driver in a wrinkled polo shirt. Strangers who had become something more in the space of an afternoon. Inside, the VA was a world unto itself. The waiting room stretched out before them, filled with rows of chairs occupied by men and women of every age. Some wore caps like the old man's, adorned with unit patches and service ribbons. Others wore nothing that identified their service at all, their sacrifices invisible to the casual observer. A television mounted in the corner played news that no one was watching. The smell of floor wax and antiseptic hung in the air like a memory. The old man approached the check-in desk, where a young woman in scrubs looked up from her computer with practiced efficiency. "Clement Birch," he said. "I have an appointment with Dr. Nguyen. I'm afraid I am quite late." The woman typed something into her system, then smiled. "Dr. Nguyen is running behind himself today. You are actually right on time. Have a seat, and we will call you when he is ready." The old man nodded his thanks and turned toward the waiting area. Jalen followed, scanning the room for empty seats. They found 2 chairs near the window, set slightly apart from the others, and settled in a wait. Jalen looked around at the other veterans. So many faces, so many stories he would never know. How many of them had spent time in cages or carried brothers through jungles or made impossible choices in impossible circumstances? How many of them had built walls around their memories and learned to live in the silence between heartbeats? The old man seemed to read his thoughts. Every person in this room has a story. His voice was low, meant only for Jalen. Some of them are heroes who will never be recognized. Some of them are carrying weight that would crush most people. And some of them are just trying to survive another day. He gestured subtly toward a man across the room, perhaps 60 years old, sitting alone with his hands clasped tightly in his lap. See him? The way his eyes keep moving to the exits. The way his shoulders are hunched like he is expecting an attack. He has seen combat, probably multiple deployments. He is still fighting a war that ended years ago, except now the enemy is inside his own head. Jalen watched the man and saw what the old man was describing. The hypervigilance, the tension, the look of someone who had never fully come home. What about her? Jalen nodded toward a woman in her 30s who sat reading a magazine, her posture relaxed but her eyes distant. The old man studied her for a moment. Harder to tell, but look at her hands. The way her fingers keep moving, even though she is not turning pages. She's counting something. Breaths, maybe. Or heartbeats. a technique for staying grounded when your mind wants to drift somewhere else. She has learned to manage her demons, but they are still there, waiting. Jalen felt a chill run down his spine. The old man was reading these people like books, seeing through their surfaces to the battles raging underneath. It was the same skill that had allowed him to notice guard patterns and calculate patrol schedules and find weaknesses in camp perimeters. The ability to pay attention, to truly see. How do you do that? Jalen asked. How do you see so much? Practice. The old man's voice was matter-of-fact. 50 years of looking at people and trying to understand what they are carrying. It started in the camp, when noticing the small things could mean the difference between life and death. A guard who was distracted, a fence post that had rotted, a fellow prisoner who was giving up. After a while, it becomes second nature. You cannot turn it off even when you want to. He turned to look at Jalen directly. You have the same gift, whether you know it or not. That is why you stopped the car. That is why you asked questions instead of driving in silence. You noticed something in me that most people miss. A story that needed to be told. A weight that needed to be shared. Before Jalen could respond, movement across the room caught his attention. An elderly man had entered the waiting area, walking with the slow determination of someone whose body had betrayed him, but whose spirit refused to surrender. He wore a cap similar to the old man's, faded and worn, with a patch that Jalen could not identify from his distance. The newcomer scanned the room, his eyes moving across faces with the same watchful intensity Jalen had seen in Clement. Then his gaze landed on the old man beside Jalen, and something changed. The newcomer froze. His hand went to his chest, pressing against his heart as if checking to make sure it was still beating. His lips moved, forming a word that Jalen could not hear from across the room. Then he started walking toward them. His pace quickened with each step, the limp in his gait forgotten, his eyes fixed on the old man with an intensity that made Jalen's breath catch. The old man had noticed him too. Jalen watched as recognition dawned on that weathered face, as the quiet stillness gave way to something raw and unguarded. The newcomer stopped in front of them. Up close, Jalen could see tears streaming down his face, could see his hands trembling at his sides, could see the patch on his cap now. A unit insignia that meant nothing to Jalen, but clearly meant everything to the two men staring at each other. When the newcomer spoke, his voice cracked on every syllable. Rattlesnake. The word came out like a prayer. Oh my God, Rattlesnake. It is really you. The old man rose slowly from his chair, and for the first time since Jalen had met him, his composure cracked completely. Corporal Whitfield. The name came out in a whisper. James, I thought you were in Arizona. And then they were embracing, two old men holding each other in the middle of a VA waiting room, sobbing openly while everyone around them stopped to watch. The waiting room had gone silent. Every head had turned toward the two old men embracing in the center of the room, tears streaming down weathered faces, decades of distance collapsing into a single moment of recognition. Jalen stood frozen beside the empty chairs, watching something unfold that he did not fully understand but knew instinctively was sacred. James Whitfield pulled back just far enough to look at the old man's face, his hands still gripping Clement's shoulders as if afraid he might disappear. I moved back 6 months ago. His voice was ragged, broken by sobs. My daughter lives here now. Grandchildren. I have been coming to this VA for my heart. Never thought I would see you. Never in a million years. Clement's hands came up to cup the other man's face, a gesture so tender that Jalen felt like an intruder witnessing it. James. Clement's voice was thick with emotion. You look good. You look so good. The other man let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I look like an old man who has outlived most of the people he loves. But I'm still here, still breathing. Because of you. He turned then, noticing Jalen for the first time. His eyes were red-rimmed, but sharp, taking in a young man with the same quick assessment Clement had described. Who is this? Clement placed a hand on Jalen's shoulder, drawing him into the circle of their reunion. This is Jalen. He was my driver today. My phone died, and my GPS failed, and we ended up spending 2 hours talking instead of 10 minutes driving. I told him things I have not spoken aloud in years. James studied Jalen with new interest. His gaze dropped to the polo shirt, the khaki pants, the ordinary uniform of an Uber driver. Then it returned to Jalen's face, searching for something. You listened to him? The question carried weight. You actually listened? Yes, sir. Jalen heard the formality enter his own voice automatically. I listened to everything. James turned back to Clement, and something passed between them. A look that communicated more than words ever could. The silent language of men who had survived the unsurvivable together. Then you know, James said to Jalen, you know what this man did? What he sacrificed? What he carries? I know some of it. Jalen answered honestly. I know about the camp, the escapes, the missions to bring men home. I know about Samuel Okonkwo and the promise he made. I know about the 23. James shook his head slowly, almost reverently. The 23. That is what they call it now. Like it was just a number, just a statistic. He turned to face Jalen fully, and his voice took on the cadence of testimony. Let me tell you what that number means. I was one of them, not from the original escape. I was in a different camp, 40 miles north. By the time Rattlesnake found us, I had been there for 26 months. I had watched 9 men die. I had stopped believing anyone was coming. I had started picking out which beam in our cage I would use to hang myself when I finally gave up. His voice cracked, but he pushed through, and then one night, the guards started shouting. Gunfire everywhere. Explosions. I thought it was the end. I thought they were killing us all. But then the door of my cage opened, and there was this face looking in at me. This impossible face. And a voice saying 4 words I will never forget as long as I live. He looked at Clement, and his eyes overflowed again. I am here for you. That is what he said. I am here for you. And then he picked me up and carried me out of that hell and did not stop moving until we were on a helicopter headed home. The waiting room was utterly silent. Other veterans had risen from their seats, drawn closer by the gravity of what they were witnessing. Jalen saw the hypervigilant man from earlier standing nearby, tears running down his face. The woman who had been counting her breaths had set down her magazine, her hand pressed over her mouth. James turned to address the gathered crowd, his voice gaining strength. This man is a hero. I do not care what the classified files say. I do not care what medals he was given or not given. I was dead. I was already dead in every way that mattered. And this man walked into a camp full of armed guards in the middle of enemy territory and carried me out on his back. He reached up and removed his cap, revealing a bald head marked with age, spots, and scars. He held the cap over his heart like a flag. My name is James Whitfield. I am 76 years old. I have 3 children and 7 grandchildren. I have been married for 14 years. And none of that exists without this man. None of it. Every birthday my grandchildren celebrate. Every Christmas morning. Every ordinary Tuesday. All of it traces back to a night in Laos when Rattlesnake came for me. One by one, the other veterans in the room began to stand. Jalen watched in amazement as old men and women rose from their chairs, some with difficulty, some with the help of canes and walkers, but all of them rising. It was not a coordinated gesture. It was simply what happened when people recognized something that demanded respect. Clement stood in the center of it all, tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by a recognition he had never sought and never expected. Please. His voice came out barely above a whisper. Please, everyone sit down. I am not a hero. I just did what anyone would have done. No. James's voice cut through the room. Not anyone. You. You did it. And we are standing because you spent 50 years carrying this weight alone, never asking for thanks, never seeking recognition, and today we have a chance to show you that we remember, that we know, that your sacrifices were not invisible. The man with the hypervigilant eyes stepped forward. He was younger than Clement and James, probably Vietnam era, based on his age. I did not serve with you. His voice was rough. I do not know your story, but know what it means to carry weight that no one else can see. I know what it means to wonder if anyone remembers. And I am standing because today I see a man who deserves to know that he is not forgotten. Another veteran spoke up. A woman in her 50s with close-cropped gray hair. My father was MIA in Laos. 1971. They never found him, never brought him home. But if there were men like you out there trying to find men like him, then I need you to know that it mattered. Even the ones you could not save. It mattered that you tried. Clement's composure finally broke completely. His knees buckled, and James caught him, held him upright, the same way Clement had once carried James through the jungle. Jalen watched the scene unfold with tears blurring his vision. 2 hours ago, he had picked up what he thought was just another fare. An old man in a faded cap, heading to a routine appointment. And now he was witnessing something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The weight of unrecognized service. The power of unexpected recognition. The way a single conversation could crack open a lifetime of silence and let the light come flooding in. A nurse appeared at the edge of the crowd, clipboard in hand, looking bewildered by the scene before her. "Mr. Birch, Dr. Nguyen is ready for you now." Clement straightened slowly, wiping his face with the back of his hand. James kept one arm around his shoulders, steadying him. "I need a moment," Clement said to the nurse. "Please, just a moment." The nurse nodded and stepped back, and the veterans who had risen remained standing, unwilling to break the spell of what was happening. In the center of it all, Clement Ashford Birch, call sign Rattlesnake, stood surrounded by strangers who had become witnesses, held upright by a brother he had carried out of darkness 50 years before. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not feel alone. The nurse waited patiently while the moment stretched and held. Jalen watched the veterans slowly return to their seats, though something in the room had changed permanently. The air felt different, charged with a recognition that would linger long after Clement disappeared through those clinic doors. James still had his arm around Clement's shoulders, and he leaned in close to speak privately. "I'm not letting you go back to that apartment alone tonight." His voice was firm but gentle. "You are coming to dinner with my family. Margaret has been asking about you for years. The grandchildren need to meet the man their grandfather would not exist without." Clement shook his head weakly. "James, I could not impose. Your family does not need an old man intruding on their evening." James gripped his shoulder tighter. "You are not an intruder. You are family. You became family the night you carried me out of that camp. And it is long past time my children understood exactly who you are and what you did." Clement looked at him for a long moment, and Jalen saw the resistance slowly drain from his face. The walls he had built were coming down, whether he wanted them to or not. "All right." The word came out like a surrender. "All right. Dinner." James nodded, satisfied. "Good. Now, go get that knee looked at. I will be right here when you come out. I'm not going anywhere." Clement turned to Jalen, and something passed between them. A look of gratitude, so profound it needed no words. "Thank you," Clement said quietly, "for stopping, for asking, for being here to see this." Jalen felt his throat tighten. "I would not have missed it for anything." Clement reached into his messenger bag and pulled out the worn journal. He held it for a moment, his fingers tracing the leather cover, and then he did something that made Jalen's heart stop. He held the journal out toward Jalen. "I want you to have this." Jalen stepped back, shaking his head. "Sir, I cannot. That journal is everything. It is your whole history. The maps, the names, the photograph." Clement's eyes were steady. "That is exactly why I want you to have it. I have carried these memories alone for 50 years. Eleanor knew some of it, but she never read the journal, never looked at the map. It was too painful for her to see where I had been." He pressed the journal into Jalen's hands. "You listened. You asked questions. You saw me. And now you have witnessed something I never expected to experience in my lifetime. The journal needs to go to someone who will understand what it means. Someone who will remember the names. Someone who will tell the stories." Jalen looked down at the worn leather in his hands. The weight of it was impossible. Decades of suffering and courage and loss compressed into pages and ink in a single photograph of 11 men who had refused to die. "I do not know if I am worthy of this." Clement's hand came to rest on Jalen's shoulder. "You became worthy the moment you pulled into that parking lot instead of dropping me at the door. You became worthy when you chose to listen instead of looking at your phone. Samuel Okonkwo would have recognized you, Jalen. He would have seen the same thing I see. A young man who pays attention. A young man who carries weight for others because he understands that we are not meant to carry it alone. James stepped forward, his eyes moving between the journal and Jalen's face. He has never given that to anyone. His voice was thick. I have known him for 50 years, and I have never seen him offer that journal to a living soul. If he is giving it to you, it means he sees something in you that he trusts. Jalen clutched the journal to his chest, feeling the edges press against his heart. I will protect it. The words came out as a vow. I will remember every name. I will tell the stories. I will make sure they are not forgotten. Clement nodded slowly, and something in his face relaxed. A tension that had been there for decades, finally releasing. That is all I needed to hear. The nurse cleared her throat gently. Mr. Birch, Dr. Nguyen really does need to see you now. We are quite behind schedule. Clement straightened his cap, touching the hidden metal beneath the fabric. He looked at James, then at Jalen, then at the room full of veterans who had witnessed his moment of unexpected recognition. I will be back soon, he said like a promise. Do not go anywhere. He walked toward the nurse with that careful, precise gait, and Jalen watched him disappear through the clinic doors. The room seemed emptier without him, as if his presence had been taking up more space than his physical body suggested. James turned to Jalen, studying him with appraising eyes. So, you're the young man who got Rattlesnake to talk. Jalen shook his head. He got himself to talk. I just asked questions. James let out a sound that was almost a laugh. Nobody just asks Clement Birch questions. The man has been silent for half a century. I call him every month, and most of the time I cannot get more than a few sentences out of him. But you, a stranger, an Uber driver, you got him to give you his journal. He shook his head in wonder. What did you say to him? Jalen thought back to the moment when everything shifted, when a dead phone and a wrong turn had become the beginning of something else entirely. I told him about my grandfather, how he served in Desert Storm and never talked about it, how I used to ask him questions and he would change the subject, how he died 6 months ago, and I realized I never really knew his story. James was quiet for a moment. That would do it. Clement always had a soft spot for young people who wanted to understand. It is why he went back all those times. Not for glory, not for medals, because somewhere in those camps were young men who deserved to go home and have grandchildren who would ask them questions someday. Jalen looked down at the journal in his hands. He said I reminded him of Samuel Okonkwo, the medic who died in the camp. James's expression shifted, became something softer and sadder. Samuel, I never met him. He died before I was captured, but Clement talks about him sometimes, on the anniversaries, when the weight gets too heavy. Samuel was the one who taught Clement that paying attention was an act of love. He reached out and touched the journal gently. If Clement sees Samuel in you, then he is trusting you with his soul. That journal is not just memories. It is his confession, his penance, his prayer. Every name in those pages is someone he tried to save, someone he lost, someone he carries. Jalen felt the weight of it press against his chest. I will not let him down. James nodded. I know you will not. He looked toward the clinic doors where Clement had disappeared. None of us ever have. The appointment took 45 minutes. Jalen waited in the lobby with James, the two of them sitting side by side in silence that felt comfortable rather than awkward. Other veterans came and went, some nodding at James with a quiet recognition of shared experience, others glancing at Jalen with curiosity about what a young man in an Uber driver's uniform was doing sitting vigil in a VA waiting room. Jalen spent the time looking through the journal, not reading it deeply, not yet. That would come later, in private, when he could give each page the attention it deserved. But he traced his fingers over the map on the first page, studied the names and dates and careful notations, felt the weight of history pressing against his palms. He found a photograph tucked into the back, those 11 faces staring up at him from a jungle clearing half a century gone. He found a young Clement in the center, hollow-eyed but fierce, and tried to reconcile that image with the quiet old man who had climbed into his car 3 hours ago. 3 hours. It felt like a lifetime. When Clement finally emerged from the clinic, He was moving more easily than before. Whatever Dr. Nguyen had done seemed to have helped. James rose immediately and went to him, the two old men falling in a step beside each other with the ease of brothers. "How is the knee?" Clement shrugged. "They adjusted something. Gave me new exercises. Said I need to come back in 6 weeks." "The usual." "Good." James clapped him gently on the shoulder. "Now, let us get you to dinner. Margaret is already cooking. I called her while you were in there. She cried when I told her who I found in the waiting room." Clement's face softened. "She always was too kind to me. She loves you." James said simply. "We all do. You just never let us show it." They walked toward the exit, and Jalen followed, still clutching the journal to his chest. At the doors, Clement stopped and turned to face him. "You're coming too." Jalen blinked. "Sir, I could not intrude on your reunion. This is a family dinner." Clement shook his head. "You are part of this now, whether you meant to be or not. You witnessed something today that very few people have ever seen. You carry that journal, which means you carry part of me. The least I could do is feed you." James nodded in agreement. "Besides, my grandchildren need to hear this story. All of it, from the beginning. And it would be good for them to see the young man who got their great-uncle Clement to finally open up." Great-uncle. Jalen caught the term, the way it implied a bond that transcended blood. "He is not actually my uncle," James clarified with a small smile. "But that is what my children have called him since they were old enough to talk. Uncle Clement, the mysterious relative who sent birthday cards but never visited. They're going to lose their minds when they hear the truth." Jalen thought about his dead phone in the cup holder of his car. The fares he had missed. The money he had lost. The 14-hour shift that had become something else entirely. None of it mattered. "I will be honored," Jalen said. "Thank you." They walked out into the late afternoon sunlight, the three of them moving together toward the parking lot. James had driven himself, an old pickup truck with a faded American flag sticker in the back window. Clement would ride with him. Jalen would follow in his own car, the one that had carried a legend without knowing it. At the edge of the lot, Clement stopped and looked back at the VA Medical Center. The building stood solid and unassuming, full of stories that would never be told, sacrifices that would never be recognized, weights that would be carried in silence until the carriers were gone. "I used to hate this place." Clement's voice was quiet. "I saw it as a reminder of everything I lost. Every friend who did not make it. Every mission that went wrong. Every name I cannot save." He turned to look at Jalen and James, his eyes clear and present in a way they had not been at the start of the day. "But today I walked out of those doors and found a brother I had not seen in 3 years. Today I told my story to a stranger who became something more. Today I was seen by a room full of people who understood what it means to carry weight in silence." He reached up and touched his cap, feeling the hidden metal beneath the fabric. "Eleanor used to say that healing happens in moments we do not expect. That Grace shows up wearing disguises." I think she was right. I think Grace showed up today wearing an Uber driver's uniform and a dead phone. Jalen felt tears threatening again. He did not fight them. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us every day in disguises we do not recognize, please subscribe to our channel and share in the comments. Who is the quiet hero in your life that deserves recognition? Sometimes the people carrying the heaviest weight are the ones who never ask for help. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply paying attention. Thank you for watching. 6 months later, Jalen Monroe graduated from nursing school at the top of his class. He had changed his clinical focus halfway through the program, switching from pediatrics to geriatric care at the VA hospital where he had once dropped off a fare and stayed for 3 hours. He worked the same floor where Clement came for his appointments now. They saw each other every 6 weeks, and each visit ended with coffee in the cafeteria and stories from the journal that Jalen had memorized cover to cover. James Whitfield came to Jalen's graduation. So did David Chun, who had flown in from Seattle. So did the families of Martin Reyes and Gerald Sutton, who had heard about the young nurse who carried Rattlesnake's journal and wanted to meet him for themselves. Clement sat in the front row, wearing his faded cap with the hidden metal, his hands folded in his lap the same way they had been folded on that first day in the back seat of an Uber. When Jalen's name was called, Clement rose slowly to his feet and began to clap. One by one, the other veterans in the audience stood with him. James, David, families of the fallen and the saved. A room full of people who understood that some debts could never be repaid, only honored. Jalen walked across the stage with the journal tucked inside his jacket, pressed against his heart. He had carried it every day since Clement had placed it in his hands. He would carry it for the rest of his life. After the ceremony, Clement found him in the crowd. The old man's eyes were wet, but he was smiling. Samuel would have been proud of you. His voice cracked on the name. You pay attention. You listen. You carry weight for others. That is all any of us can do. Jalen embraced him carefully, mindful of the fragile bones beneath the faded plaid shirt. Thank you, he whispered, for trusting me, for seeing me, for getting into my car that day. Clement pulled back and looked at him with eyes that held 50 years of darkness and light. Thank you for asking about my hat. They stood together in the afternoon sunlight, an old man and a young man, a legend and a nurse, connected by a dead phone and a traffic jam and the simple courage to pay attention. Some conversations last 2 hours. Some change everything. And some, if you're lucky, become the reason you dedicate your life to something bigger than yourself. Clement Ashford Birch lived for 4 more years. He spent them surrounded by family he had found and family he had made, telling stories he had kept silent for half a century, watching his legacy pass into hands that would carry it forward. When he died, Jalen was holding his hand. The journal was open on the bedside table, turned to the page with the photograph of 11 men in a jungle clearing. The last word Clement spoke was a name. Samuel. And somewhere in the space between heartbeats, a young medic who had died, believing help was coming finally saw that it had.